September 1887, territory of Oklahoma. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, a town carved from red earth and stubborn hope. In the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town, a woman stood before an empty classroom, her hands trembling as she arranged primers on wooden desks. Sarah Whitfield, though that was not the name her Cherokee grandmother had whispered to her as a child, smoothed her plain brown skirt and touched the cameo brooch at her throat. The jewelry had belonged to her white father's mother, a woman who never knew her son had loved a Cherokee woman, with eyes like starlight and hands that could heal both hearts and bodies. Sarah had learned early that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible, blending into the spaces where she did not quite belong, but where she could do the most good. Her skin was pale enough, her eyes green rather than the deep brown of her mother's people, her hair the color of autumn leaves rather than midnight. She had practiced speaking without the soft cadence her grandmother's stories had given her voice, had learned to hold her spine straight in the way white women did when they wanted to claim space in a world that questioned their right to it. The sound of boots on the schoolhouse steps made her heart quicken. Through the window she watched a tall figure approach, badge glinting silver against a dark vest. Sheriff Marcus Webb. She had seen him from a distance during her first week in town, noticing the way children scattered like startled birds when he walked past, not from fear, but from the kind of respect reserved for men who carried authority without cruelty. He knocked once, then entered without waiting for permission. His hat came off immediately, revealing hair the color of wheat and eyes that held the steady patience of a man accustomed to waiting for truth to surface. "Miss Whitfield," he said, voice low and careful as mountain stone, "I'm Marcus Webb. I wanted to welcome you to Cedar Ridge and see if you need anything to get started." She turned toward him, her practiced smile settling over features that had learned to hide more than they revealed. "Sheriff Webb, that's very kind. The children have been wonderful, and the families quite welcoming." Something flickered behind his eyes, the way a man looks when he hears music in a foreign language, beautiful but just beyond understanding. "You're not from around here," initially he said, not quite a question. "Illinois," she replied sleuthily, the lie as familiar as prayer. "My aunt left me a small inheritance, enough to travel west and find work." The silence stretched between them, filled with the scent of chalk dust and September heat. Marcus Webb studied her with the same attention he might give fresh tracks in mud, reading signs she hoped remained invisible. "Well," he said finally, his voice warming slightly, "this town's been without a proper teacher for nearly 2 years. The children need someone who'll stick around, someone who understands what learning can do for a person." Sarah felt something twist beneath her ribs. If only he knew how much she understood about the power of learning, about the way education could build bridges between worlds or burn them down entirely. "I intend to stay, Sheriff Webb," she said, and for the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, she meant it entirely. He settled his hat back over his hair, fingers lingering on the brim. "Ma'am," he said with a slight nod, and then he was gone, leaving only the scent of leather and something else, cedar, perhaps, or sage. Sarah sank into the chair behind her desk, hands pressed flat against the scarred wood. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like whispered warnings, and she wondered how long a person could live between two truths before one of them demanded to be spoken aloud. The weeks fell into rhythm like water finding its course. Sarah arrived at the schoolhouse before dawn, lit the stove, and arranged lessons with the precision of a woman who understood that preparation was armor against discovery. Her students, 12 children ranging from 6 to 14, came carrying lunch pails and curiosity in equal measure. She taught them letters and numbers, but also the kinds of lessons that lived between the lines: how to listen before speaking, how to see beauty in ordinary things, how to ask questions that mattered. Little Mary Hutchins, barely 7, with pigtails the color of corn silk, had taken to lingering after the other children left. "Miss Whitfield," she asked one afternoon, voice small and uncertain, "why do some folks say there ain't no good Indians?" The question hit Sarah like a stone thrown at glass. She knelt beside Mary's desk, choosing words her grandmother had chosen herbs, carefully and purposefully. "Some people fear what they don't understand, sweetheart," she said gently. "But fear can make us blind to the good in others. There are good and bad people in every family, just like there are good and bad apples in every orchard." Mary nodded solemnly, then skipped toward the door where her older brother waited. Sarah remained kneeling, her reflection caught in the window as afternoon light slanted across the floor. 2 streets away, Marcus Webb sat in his office reading a telegram that had arrived on the morning stage. Reports of Cherokee families moving through the territory, some heading north toward Kansas, others disappearing into the hills where treaties meant less than survival. The territorial governor wanted them found, documented, and relocated to the designated areas where the government could keep account of their movements. Marcus folded the telegram, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that came from orders that sat poorly in a man's gut. He had been a sheriff for 6 years, long enough to understand the difference between law and justice, long enough to know they didn't always shake hands. The Cherokee weren't raiders or thieves. Most were families trying to find places to call home in a world that kept redrawing the maps beneath their feet. But orders were orders, and a badge carried responsibilities that didn't bend for personal feelings. That evening, he found himself walking past the schoolhouse without quite knowing why. Light glowed golden through the windows, and he could see Miss Whitfield inside, bent over papers at her desk. Her hand had come loose from its pins, falling around her face in waves that caught the lamplight. She looked younger than her 25 years, more vulnerable than the composed teacher who faced down unruly students with gentle firmness. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Through the glass he watched her press her fingers to her temples, shoulders curved with exhaustion. There was something about the gesture, about the way she held herself when she thought no one was watching, that reminded him of his mother in the months after his father died. The weight of carrying more than one person should bear, of smiling when the world felt ready to cave in. Instead of knocking, he left a basket of late-season apples on the schoolhouse steps and walked back into the gathering dusk. Sarah found the apples the next morning, their red skins bright with dew. No note, no signature, but somehow she knew. That afternoon, when Sheriff Webb stopped by to ask if she'd noticed any strangers passing through, she offered him coffee and a slice of apple cake made from his gift. They sat across from each other at her desk, the space between them filled with things neither dared name. "The cake is excellent," he said, fork pausing midway to his mouth. "Family recipe?" "Something like that," she replied, thinking of her grandmother's hands guiding hers as they mixed cornmeal and wild honey, of lessons learned in kitchens that smelled of wood smoke and sage. Marcus watched her face, noting the way her eyes grew distant when he thought she wasn't watching, as well as the way she sometimes paused before answering simple questions. She was a mystery in a town where secrets were rare and usually involved nothing more scandalous than borrowed money or borrowed affection. But Sarah Whitfield carried her secrets like sacred things, held close and protected. Later that evening, alone in his small house behind the jail, Marcus found himself wondering about a woman who made apple cake that tasted like memory and taught children to see past their fears. In her room above the general store,
Sarah braided her hair by lamplight and tried not to think about the way the sheriff's eyes crinkled when he smiled, or how his voice grew softer when he spoke her name. She pulled her grandmother's shawl around her shoulders, a blanket woven with patterns that told stories older than the town of Cedar Ridge, older than the treaties that had scattered her people like seeds on the wind. Tomorrow, she would teach children to read words that might help them build bridges to better lives. Tonight, she would pray to the spirits of her grandmother's people and ask for the strength to keep walking the line between two worlds without losing her footing entirely. October painted the hills in shades of fire and gold, and with the changing season came changes that neither Sarah nor Marcus could have anticipated.
The morning brought a rider from the territorial capital, dust-covered and urgent, with news that made the sheriff's jaw clench and his hand instinctively move toward his gun. Cherokee band spotted 20 miles north, moving east. Orders are to intercept and escort them to the agency. No exceptions. Marcus read the dispatch twice, his chest tightening with each word. The Cherokee weren't cattle to be herded, but the territorial government saw them that way, moving obstacles to be managed and contained. He folded the paper carefully, his mind already working through the logistics of what felt more like betrayal than duty. An hour later, he found himself at the schoolhouse, though he couldn't quite explain why. Sarah was teaching geography, her finger tracing routes across a hand-drawn map tacked to the wall. When she saw him through the window, something flickered across her face as quick as lightning, there and gone before he could name it. "Children," she said, voice steady as granite, "take out your arithmetic books and work the problems on page 12. I'll be right back." She stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her. The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out sharp and lonesome. "Sheriff Webb," she said, hands folded at her waist, "what brings you by?" He studied her face, noting the tension around her eyes, the way she held herself as if preparing for impact. "Just wanted to let you know I'll be away from town for a few days. Territorial business. Need to ask you to keep an eye out for anything unusual. Strangers passing through, folks who might not belong." The words "might not belong" hung in the air between them like a cloud of smoke. Sarah's throat tightened, but her voice remained calm. "Of course. I'll be sure to let you know if I see anything." Marcus hesitated, hat turning slowly in his hands. "Miss Whitfield, can I ask you something?" She nodded, though every instinct told her to flee. "Have you ever felt caught between two things, two ways of being in the world that don't quite fit together?" The question was so unexpected, so close to her daily struggle, that she forgot to guard her expression. For just a moment, he saw past the careful composure to something raw and honest underneath. "Every day," she whispered, then caught herself. "I mean, teaching can be like that, trying to prepare children for a world that's changing faster than anyone can predict." He nodded slowly, as if her words had unlocked something he'd been trying to understand about himself. "That's it exactly. The law says one thing, but a man's conscience might say another. What do you do when those two things pull in opposite directions?" Sarah looked at him and saw not just the badge and the authority it represented, but the man underneath. Someone wrestling with the same questions that kept her awake at night, the same struggle between duty and truth. "You follow the compass that points toward kindness," she said finally, "even when the map says you're going the wrong way." Something passed between them then, a recognition deeper than words. For a heartbeat, Sarah felt the dangerous pull of honesty, the urge to tell him everything, the name she'd been born with, the grandmother who'd taught her that courage meant protecting those who couldn't defend themselves, the reason she'd come to Cedar Ridge in the first place. But before she could speak, the schoolhouse door opened, and little Mary Hutchins peeked out. "Miss Whitfield, Tommy Miller's got his arithmetic book stuck in the stovepipe and won't tell us how it happened." The moment broke like a soap bubble.
Sarah smiled, though it felt fragile as spun glass. "Duty calls," she said. And Marcus nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Be safe out there, Sheriff Webb." "And Sheriff?" He turned back, eyebrows raised. "Remember what I said about kindness. It's usually in the right direction, even when it doesn't feel that way." That afternoon, as Marcus rode north with his deputy and a territorial marshal whose eyes were as cold as January, he carried Sarah's words with him like a talisman. 20 miles ahead, a small band of Cherokee families moved through the hills, searching for a safe place to rest. Among them was an elderly woman whose granddaughter had left years ago, passing into the white world to teach children and carry forward the old wisdom in new forms. The woman looked toward the south, where dust clouds suggested riders approaching, and whispered a prayer for protection, not just for her people, but for the granddaughter who carried their blood and their stories into places where such things had to remain hidden. In Cedar Ridge, Sarah stood at her classroom window, watching the horizon and feeling the pull of blood and duty, like two horses trying to run in opposite directions. The children worked quietly at their desks, innocent of the storm gathering in the distance, while her teacher pressed her hand to the glass and wondered how long a heart could hold two truths before it broke from the weight of keeping them apart. The confrontation took place on a Thursday morning, when the sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Sarah was teaching the children about migration patterns of birds, explaining how creatures followed ancient routes written in their bones, when she saw the dust cloud approaching from the north. Her heart stopped. Through the window, she watched Sheriff Webb ride into town, his face grim as winter stone. Behind him rode his deputy and a man she didn't recognize, followed by a wagon filled with Cherokee families. Even from across the street, she could see the exhaustion in their faces, the way the children clung to their mothers, the proud set of the men's shoulders despite their defeat. And there, sitting straight-backed in the wagon bed, was a woman whose face Sarah would have recognized in the deepest darkness, her grandmother. Ayanna sat among the other captives with the dignity of a queen in exile, her silver hair braided with strips of blue cloth, her dark eyes scanning the town with the sharp awareness of someone who had survived too much to be easily broken. When her gaze fell on the schoolhouse window, she saw Sarah's pale face pressed against the glass, her eyes widened with recognition and something deeper. Love, grief, understanding. Sarah's hand flew to her throat, fingers closing around the cameo brooch that had been her disguise and her shield. The children sensed the change in their teacher, the way stillness could suddenly carry weight. "Miss Whitfield," Tommy Miller said, voice small and worried, "you look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost, sweetheart," Sarah managed, her voice barely steady. "Sometimes the past finds us when we least expect it." She watched Marcus climb down from his horse, his movements heavy with reluctance. Even from this distance, she could read the conflict in his shoulders, the way he removed his hat and ran his hair through his hair when he was wrestling with something that had no good answers. The territorial marshal was already barking orders, pointing toward the jail, gesturing for the families to be moved inside where they could be processed before the journey to the agency. Sarah's grandmother stood slowly, her movements careful but unbroken. When a young soldier reached out to help her down from the wagon, she smiled and spoke softly in Cherokee. The boy, barely old enough to shave, looked confused and glanced toward Marcus for guidance. "She's thanking you," Marcus said quietly, his voice hoarse, "for treating her with respect." The old woman's eyes found Sarah again through the schoolhouse window, and this time she smiled. It was a smile full of secrets and sorrow, pride and love, the kind of expression that could break a heart or heal it, depending on the courage of the person receiving it. Sarah made her decision with the suddenness of a lightning strike. She turned from the window, her voice calm as deep water. "Children, please continue reading Chapter 12. I need to step outside for a moment." "But Miss Whitfield," Tommy Miller started, his gap-toothed grin fading as he saw her expression. "What if strangers come while you're gone?" "Then you remember what we've learned," Sarah said, her hand already on the door. "Sometimes strangers are just friends we haven't met yet. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is offer kindness to someone who needs it." She walked across the street with measured steps, her spine straight, her hands steady despite the earthquake in her chest. Marcus saw her coming, and something in his face shifted, a recognition that went deeper than surprise. The territorial marshal, a thin man with cruel eyes and a voice like gravel, was shouting orders when Sarah approached. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned in front of a classroom. "These people look exhausted. Perhaps they could use some water and food before continuing their journey." The marshal turned to her with a dismissive look, a look men like him reserve for women who spoke out of turn. "Ma'am, this is official business. These Indians need to be moved to the agency as quickly as possible for everyone's safety." Sarah's eyes never left his face, but she felt her grandmother's presence like warmth at her back. "With respect, sir, these are families, mothers, children, and elders who've been traveling for days. Surely common decency suggests they deserve a moment's rest and care."
The marshal's laugh was ugly as a crow's call. "Common decency doesn't apply to savages, miss. Best you get back to your schoolhouse and leave this to men who understand the situation." The word savages hit Sarah like a physical blow, but instead of stepping back, she stepped forward. "My name is Sarah Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying across the dusty street like a bell. "I'm the teacher here, and I've been part of this community for 3 months. These people are not savages. They're human beings who deserve to be treated with the same respect you'd want for your own family." Behind her, she heard her grandmother's voice, soft and proud, speaking in Cherokee. The old woman was telling the other families who Sarah was, what name she'd been born with, why she'd had to leave. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but she didn't turn around. Marcus Webb stood frozen between his duty and his heart, watching the woman he'd grown to care for reveal herself as someone else entirely. The badge on his chest felt heavy as lead, but the look in Sarah's eyes when she turned to him was clear as mountain water. She wasn't asking him to choose sides. She was asking him to choose what kind of man he wanted to be. "Sheriff Webb," Sarah said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "I believe these people have been traveling without proper supplies. Perhaps we could allow them to rest in the church while food is prepared? It would be the Christian thing to do." The marshal started to object, but Marcus held up his hand. "The lady's right," he said slowly. "These folks look like they could use a hot meal and a safe place to rest. We can spare a few hours." As he spoke, Sarah's grandmother stepped forward, her aged hand reaching out to touch Sarah's cheek with infinite tenderness. In Cherokee, she spoke words that sounded like blessings and forgiveness, like welcome and goodbye. Sarah closed her eyes and answered in the same language, her voice carrying the melody her grandmother had taught her as a child, the cadence she'd spent 3 months learning to hide. When she opened her eyes, Marcus Webb was staring at her with the expression of a man seeing the world shift beneath his feet. But instead of betrayal in his gaze, she saw something else entirely: understanding, and maybe, despite everything, the beginning of a deeper kind of love. The truth, once released, moved through Cedar Ridge like wildfire through dry grass. By evening, everyone knew that their schoolteacher was Sarah Crowfeather, granddaughter of the Cherokee medicine woman now sitting in their church, half white and half something that made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't name. Some families pulled their children from school. Others stood in tight clusters on street corners, voices low and angry. But some, like Mary Hutchins's mother, simply asked when Miss Whitfield would be back to teaching, because Mary had been reading stories to her baby brother, and they both needed someone who understood that learning was a gift, no matter who offered it. Marcus found Sarah at sunset, sitting on the church steps beside her grandmother. The old woman was teaching her granddaughter a song in Cherokee, their voices weaving together like water over stones. He approached slowly, hat in his hands, his badge unpinned and folded in his shirt pocket. Sarah looked up when his shadow fell across them, her eyes wary but unafraid. She had lived with the fear of discovery for so long that its absence felt strange, like phantom pain from a wound that had finally healed. "Sheriff Webb," she said quietly, "I suppose you have questions." Marcus sat down on the step below them, close enough to see the exhaustion in Sarah's face, the way her grandmother's hand rested protectively on her shoulder. "I resigned this afternoon," he said simply. "I told the territorial marshal that I was done taking orders that went against everything I believed about right and wrong." Sarah's breath caught. "The town needs a sheriff." "Perhaps, but it doesn't need one who can't distinguish between law and justice." Her grandmother spoke in Cherokee, her voice warm with approval. Marcus looked between them, and Sarah translated despite herself. "She says you have the heart of a warrior, even if you wear the clothes of a white man. She says such men are rare and should be treasured." Marcus smiled, and for the first time in days it reached his eyes. "Tell her I'm honored. And tell her I'm sorry for what my people have done to hers." The conversation that followed happened in 3 languages: English, Cherokee, and the deeper language of hearts learning to trust each other. Sarah's grandmother told stories of the old days, when Cherokee children learned alongside white children in mission schools, when treaties were meant to be honored, and when differences were seen as bridges rather than walls. Marcus talked about his father, a man who believed that justice meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. As stars appeared overhead, the territorial marshal and his men prepared to leave with their Cherokee prisoners, their wagon one family lighter. Sarah's grandmother had convinced them she was too old and sick to travel, a lie delivered so convincingly that even Sarah almost believed it. The marshal didn't care enough to argue. He had enough Indians to satisfy his superiors, and one old woman more or less wouldn't change his report. The church emptied except for a grandmother who had found her way home, a granddaughter who no longer had to choose between her 2 names, and a man who had learned that some things mattered more than badges and orders. That night, as Cedar Ridge settled into uneasy sleep, Sarah walked the streets of the town that had become home in ways she'd never expected. Some windows were dark and unwelcoming, curtains drawn tight against the sight of her, but others glowed with lamplight, and she could see families gathered around dinner tables, parents reading to children, the ordinary miracles of people building lives worth protecting. At the schoolhouse, she found Marcus waiting on the front steps, a lantern at his feet, and something wrapped in cloth beside him. "I brought you something," he said, standing as she approached. His voice was different somehow, free of the careful distance he'd maintained for months. He handed her the bundle, and when she unwrapped it, her breath caught. It was a book, leather-bound and worn, its pages filled with Cherokee stories, written in both Cherokee syllabary and English translation. "My father collected these," he said quietly. "He believed that stories were bridges between worlds, that children should know where they came from if they were going to understand where they were going." Sarah pressed the book to her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks. She had spent so many years hiding pieces of herself that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen completely, accepted entirely. Marcus stepped closer, his hand reaching up to brush away her tears. "I don't care what name you were born with," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't care what blood runs in your veins, or what language your grandmother speaks. I care that you teach children to see past their fears. I care that you make an apple cake that tastes like home. I care that you stood up to that marshal today, even knowing it might cost you everything." She looked up at him, this man who had given up his badge rather than betray his conscience, who had chosen love over duty and found they weren't opposites after all. "Sarah Crowfeather," she said softly. "That's my real name." "It's beautiful," he replied. And when he kissed her there on the schoolhouse steps, it felt like the end of one story and the beginning of another. Above them, the stars wheeled in patterns older than treaties or territorial lines, older than the borders men drew on maps to divide what could never really be separated. In the church, an old woman smiled in her sleep, dreaming of granddaughters who carried forward the best of all their worlds, of love that transcended the artificial divisions that fear created. And in the morning, when the children came to school, they would find their teacher waiting, her real name written on the blackboard, beside a Cherokee phrase that roughly translated meant, "Wisdom grows best in soil mixed with love." Some of the desks would be empty, but the ones that weren't would be filled with children ready to learn that differences were not divisions, that the heart's true compass always pointed toward kindness, and that sometimes the most important lessons couldn't be found in any book, but had to be written by brave people willing to live them out loud. The story of Sarah Crowfeather and Marcus Webb became legend in Cedar Ridge, passed down through generations as proof that love could indeed conquer the artificial boundaries that fear erected. Their marriage the following spring was performed by Sarah's grandmother according to Cherokee tradition and blessed by the Methodist minister in English, creating something new and beautiful from the joining of different ways of seeing the sacred. And if you believe that love can indeed build bridges where others see only walls, if you know that the strongest hearts are often found in the most unexpected places, then you understand why their story matters. In a world that often seems determined to divide us, they chose to prove that connection is always possible when we dare to see past surface differences to the shared humanity beneath. That is the kind of love worth believing in, worth fighting for, and worth passing on to the children who will inherit the world we leave behind.
If this tale of unexpected love, born from the darkest of circumstances, touched your heart, if you believe that even in the harshest frontier towns, true love can bloom where least expected, then you've found your home with Maverick Hearts. Here we bring you more than just romance. We bring you the raw truth of survival, the quiet strength of those who refuse to be broken, and the kind of love that rises from ashes to build something beautiful and lasting. If stories like this one stir something profound in your soul, if you hunger for more tales of redemption on the untamed frontier, make sure to show this story some love with a like. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another journey into the wild heart of the American West, where love was hard-won but worth fighting for. And don't forget to hit that notification bell, because every week we're bringing you new stories of courage, passion, and the unbreakable human spirit that tamed a continent, one heart at a time.